I've created a transaction called video example for the sake of this video, and I've selected residential sale agreement from the right hand column. I filled in everything in the contract, and I'll just go through it with you right now as how I would explain this contract when I'm sitting down with the client collecting their signatures. First, I filled in the sale agreement number. I always use the year and my client's first and last initials. We write in here Nick and Katie Boyd were the selling licensee, which basically means buyer's agents in this transaction. We're with Realty One Group, and we are representing the buyer exclusively. Joe Schmo of Lucky Dog Realty is representing the seller exclusively, so we've checked that box. And by signing right here, Bob Smith, Mr. Smith, you are acknowledging that we're representing you as buyers, and Joe is representing Steve Jobs, the seller, as the selling or as the listing agent only. So this is just an agency acknowledgement, who's who in the transaction. I leave the date blank because I don't know when Steve, the seller, is going to sign it, but we're filling this out on June 23rd. Bob is purchasing it from Steve Jobs. That should auto-fill in. We're purchasing this property in Lane County. The property address is 123 Main Street. We're going to have our buyer initial at the bottom of every single page. The purchase agreement, the purchase price is going to be $350,000. We're having him put down $2,000 earnest money. Generally 1% is the rule of thumb, so it should be more like $3,500. But I personally like to keep my clients' earnest money deposit as small as possible because that is their skin in the game. It's their risk in the transaction. If it's a really hot property, if you know you're in a multiple offer situation, then increasing that number on the front end could be effective as far as getting your offer accepted over somebody else's. If the seller, the thing that I tell my clients is this is a low earnest money deposit. If the seller doesn't like it, they can ask for more, but let's not offer that up right up front. This is a conventional loan and they're putting $50,000 down. So we take the $2,000 and subtract it from $50,000 and we get $48,000. So those are going to be combined. This will sit in escrow first. This will be deposited at closing, which means the amount to be financed is going to be approximately $300,000. This is not an all-cash transaction, so we don't fill out this section. We are financing the purchase price through America Lending with Joe Fields, just a name I made up. It's a conventional loan. And since we're writing this offer on Saturday, I'm going to check buyer agrees to secure a pre-approval letter within 2 calendar days of offer submission. It's really good to have that pre-approval letter up front, or at least to talk with the lender to know that your client can purchase the property. I wouldn't write an offer unless I knew for a fact that they've had a conversation with the lender and that they're pre-approved or very close to being pre-approved. The strongest way you can submit an offer is to actually attach the pre-approval letter to it, and you should definitely try and do that in almost every case. But in this case, since we're writing it on Saturday and I can't get a hold of the lender, I'm writing within 2 calendar days. If the property does not appraise, or if the buyer's loan falls through, if the property is not of the right condition to where the loan can go through, then our buyer has an out. These are financing contingencies. There are other financing contingencies you can write in, such as successful withdrawal from retirement account or whatever, and that's where you'd write that in. But for the sake of this offer, we'll keep it nice and simple. If the buyer has a problem with his loan and needs to switch lenders or cannot complete the transaction, we tell them that they need to let us know right away so that we can back them out and protect that earnest money. Buyer representation regarding financing. This basically says the buyer has been honest and forthcoming with providing the lender with all the details that they need, and they haven't concealed any truths from us that might affect their ability to buy the home. We have them initial at the bottom of this page. They agree to carry insurance on the property per their lender requirement. If it's a cash transaction, this is up to them, but I just let them know up front you're going to need homeowners insurance on the property, and that's a great opportunity for you to make a referral recommendation or to just to remind them that they'll need to carry that. If the property is in a flood zone, their lender is going to require them to carry flood insurance on the property. This buyer in particular needs some help with closing costs. In fact, they need about 3% of the purchase price. It may come in less, but we like to write in up to 3% of the purchase price toward his closing costs, prepaids, and reserves. That's a language we like to use. It's all encompassing, and it's very common, at least in this market, to ask for at least some concessions from the seller. Now, if it's a brand new property, if it's only been on the market for a day, there are different ways that you can handle that. You could potentially raise the sale price to wrap that in, and that'll protect the seller's net. Or if your buyer has the financial means to pay their own closing costs, that might be advisable. It really just depends on the market, the property, and what they need in order to complete the transaction. Just keep in mind that when you ask for these, it does take away from your seller's net, and it does make the offer less appealing than if those concessions were not asked for. Title insurance. The seller of the property must purchase title insurance in the state of Oregon, so they are conveying marketable title to you, free of all liens, debts, encumbrances, etc. So the only thing that your buyer is going to have secured against the property at closing is going to be their own loan. Any other loans will be paid off at closing. Property ownership is transferred via deed. In this case, we're not doing seller carried financing, which means the seller is not providing us with our own mortgage. We're going out to a bank or credit union or mortgage broker or banker and getting our own loan. We're not making payments directly to the seller, so that section does not apply. Fixtures. We're not asking for any fixtures to be removed, so the word here is except. That would be if you wanted a fence taken down, if you wanted a stove removed, that sort of thing, you would write that in. But those are considered fixtures. Anything you remove that causes damage to the home or causes it to not function properly could potentially be interpreted as a fixture. Under personal property, when we had our walkthrough, the buyer really liked the refrigerator, washer, and dryer, so we were writing that those are being included at no stated value. If it's in MLS, don't assume that it comes with the home, write it in, because if the seller ends up taking it and your buyer takes possession without the refrigerator there, oftentimes they're going to turn to you and say, why isn't my fridge here? This will protect you and your client, making sure that they get the personal property that they want. This home does not have an alarm, so we've checked no. It does not have a wood stove, so we've checked no. If it did have a wood stove, there would be a separate form to include, which is available in the forms library. Make sure you fill it out. Seller representation. Basically, the property is being disclosed to have a public sewer and public water. It does not have a well or septic system. The seller is disclosing everything via seller disclosures that they know about the property, and we're going to have a window of time to review that information once we're under contract. Some sellers make it available beforehand, but for all intents and purposes, we're just saying that we're allowing ourselves to review that information, or we're allowed to review that information. The property is sold in as-is condition. That's why we have inspections. Your buyer cannot go back to the seller and say, hey, the garbage disposal doesn't work after closing. So we're just letting them know that this is being sold in as-is condition, and that's why we're going to recommend a professional inspection. The property does not have a private well, so we've selected no. It does not have a septic, so we've selected no. If it does have one of those things, there are additional forms. Please just look at the contract or the form number and get it from the forms library and fill it out when you write the offer. For inspections, we want to make sure that we retain the right to have professional inspections on the property. The standard contract language is 10 business days from offer acceptance to have any inspections that we want on our buyer's dime. It almost always is on your buyer's dime except for certain country property. I won't get into that, but there are inspections that the seller will pay for, like a well potability test, that sort of thing. In this case, we wrote in 15 days because the market is moving very quickly right now and inspectors are busy, so we just want to make sure that we ask for enough time on the front end. It's much easier to ask for a wider inspection window up front than it is to be under contract, find out you can't book the appointment, and then have to come back and ask for that. It puts you in a weaker position, so we want to make sure we ask for it up front. You could also instead select alternative inspection procedures. There's a separate form for that. I personally don't like that document. Some people do. The reason I don't like it is because you have to write in which inspections you want to have, and this is a more broad and generally interpreted section or box to check. So I like that. It lets us do anything that we want. We don't have to spell them out up front. We don't want our buyer to waive the inspection contingency in this case. In certain cases that might be appropriate, but not in this one. The home was built in '93, so we don't have to worry about lead-based paint, but we do have 10 calendar days to review any documentation that could indicate that there is lead-based paint in the property, or we could have our own hazard assessment done on the property to see if there is lead-based paint. The escrow preference, this is going to close at Western Title. I just wrote in a random name here, Bob Stevens. The seller did indicate that they want to close with Western and with Bob Stevens, so we've written that in. If the listing doesn't say who the seller wants to close with, feel free to write in your own person. The only thing that they can do is come back and say, oops, I forgot to write that in MLS. Here's who I'd really like to use. But we have the people that we like to work with over and over again because they do a great job, and if there's an opportunity to put a deal with them, we definitely want to jump on it. We're setting the closing date to July 30th. That's about 40 days or so out from right now, which should be enough time for conventional based on how things are moving right now. We're setting possession to 5 o'clock p.m. on the date of closing. And the seller is not going to be occupying the property after closing, so we're getting the keys to our client by 5 p.m. That should be plenty of time for it to record. And the prorations are set of the closing date, so our buyer becomes responsible for all costs associated with the property once they get the keys. Since the seller is not possessing after closing, we don't have to fill out the separate occupy after closing form. However, if that is the case in your transaction, if the seller needs more time to get their stuff out, or if they're waiting on their property to close or something, and it's not a contingency sale, then you'll want to make sure that you fill out that form. And in some cases, consideration, rent, may be paid from the seller of the property to the buyer after they own it. So anyway, that's a different type of transaction, but know that you do have many options for your client to make things right and work out. Your buyer has to pay for their own utilities, and they have to put the utilities in their name by the closing date. In this case, we are asking for a home warranty. We're asking for a First American Basic home warranty. It's $290. It's going to be included in the transaction, so it's going to be paid through escrow or out of pocket by the seller. So we are asking for this and seller concessions, the closing costs. Anytime you ask for anything financial from the seller, you are weakening the offer on the front end, but depending on the market, again, and depending on how long the property's been online, you may have some flexibility in that regard. Just know that it ultimately means less in the seller's pocket, and yeah, there's some obvious outcome with that. The earnest money, if it's to be refunded, the easiest time to get it back is during your inspection contingency, which in this transaction would be in those first 15 business days. Anytime after that, it becomes a little bit more difficult unless the reason you're terminating falls under the financing contingency or maybe a non-disclosure on the seller's behalf, etc. That's going to be situationally specific, so ask your principal broker. We're not representing the seller in this, but this talks about foreign investment money and the taxes that a foreign citizen will have to pay on the sale of investment real estate. So we're not going to do anything with that. The property is zoned R1 residential, which is single family low density residential. Our buyer is agreeing to purchase it and occupy it in that way. They're not going to operate a storefront or dig a gold mine out back or anything like that. The approved use is simply to live in it. Whatever they do afterward, we can't control, but we just make sure we disclose that. Our buyer is not using tax-deferred exchange money, which is a 1031 exchange. That would be if they're selling an apartment community and turning around and buying a shopping center. That doesn't apply in this situation, so we skip over it. This property is not farm or forest land, so it's not specially assessed for property taxes. It doesn't have any forest deferral or anything like that, so we're selecting no. And it's not a historic property. It's just your run-of-the-mill 1993 built home. If there is a dispute in the transaction, it's generally over the earnest money, so this spells out how that refund of the earnest money is handled and what each party needs to do in order to get it back. It does require both parties to release that earnest money, so if one thinks they're entitled to it and the other thinks they're entitled to it, this becomes a small claims issue, and it can get a little bit hairy. Fortunately, it's not too common, and again, talk with your principal broker if you think you're heading in that direction. We're indicating that our earnest money deposit is $2,000. It's going to be deposited within 2 business days of the offer being signed and accepted by the seller. We're going to hold on to that check if the buyer writes us that check and we're holding and gives it to us when we're filling out this offer. If not, no big deal. But we're going to hold on to that earnest money and we're going to deposit it with escrow once the offer's been accepted. We're going to sign right here because we're the selling licensees, which again means buyer's agent. Fill in your office address and all that stuff. You're going to get the property disclosures, and we're going to have 5 business days to review those disclosures to make sure that the seller doesn't know anything about the property that would make us not want to buy it. The deed is going to be prepared in Bob Smith's name, our buyer, and our offer expiration is going to be tomorrow at noon. We don't want to give them a whole lot of time because this property in particular has only been on the market a few days and we know it's getting a lot of attention. Certain situations and circumstances warrant a longer offer expiration, but in this case we're giving them 24 hours, which is the minimum I would recommend giving them. If you give them 2 hours, 3 hours, people have schedules, work, that they're not living and breathing real estate like us, so I think 24 hours is very appropriate. Make sure you have your client sign here. You don't need to fill out this information right now. The seller is going to come back in one of 3 ways. They're either going to accept it, reject it, or provide us with a counteroffer, and they will sign the appropriate line indicating what they're doing. Make sure you have your client initial at the bottom of this.